into the panel discussion and press conference for today. So give us another minute to make sure that we got everybody in there, and we'll start in a second here. All right, it looks like we're ready. Before we begin, let me tell everybody that we are recording this. It looks like we may exceed the 100 people that we can support on the Zoom today. If you know somebody that was not registered in time, we are going to record this, and we will be posting this on YouTube later in the day. So they won't miss out completely. They just will not be able to join us live. And anyway, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Judge. I'm an instructor of anthropology and the archaeologist in the Native American Studies Center here at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster. As a member of an unrecognized tribe, my people have long felt the impact of a European invader whose last name began with the letter C. I am of the Celtic tribe of Ireland, and that man's name was Oliver Cromwell, responsible for thousands of deaths in the 17th century, about the same number that died here in the United States during the Trail of Tears in the 19th century. And I begin my comments today in this fashion to illustrate that the history of the world is filled with events and misdeeds similar to the one for today's topic. I've read that Columbus's expeditions opened this part of the world for colonization, and ultimately that led to the founding of the United States. Well, that's kind of an interesting thought. If there's, well, how about this? If there's still an urge to credit a European as the first, let me share my slides, as the first to reach North America, well, I got a different opinion on this. If we want to get the first European in North America, why not celebrate Irish monk St. Brendan the Navigator, one of my people? His journey has been handed down through the generations by oral tradition since he returned from 7 years in paradise, as they described it, to his home in County Kerry, Ireland, in the year AD 544, edging out Columbus by 948 years. Or, if you desire more concrete evidence than a Celtic myth, why not attribute the founding to Norseman Leif Erikson, who edged out Columbus by almost 500 years when he discovered Vinland? Archaeological evidence of the North in North America was discovered in the 1960s in Newfoundland, dates to 990 to 1050 Christian era. It's Canadian National Historic Site, and it's now listed by the United Nations as a World Heritage Site. Now, interestingly, I've read the Scandinavian sagas credit the Irish as the first Europeans in North America. Leif Erikson Day is observed on October 9th each year by annual presidential proclamation, since it was unanimously authorized by Congress in 1964. So that was Friday, and the president each year also does a similar proclamation for Columbus Day. Now, if it must be an Italian, why not credit another Italian explorer? In reality, he was Venetian. John Cabot, AKA Giovanni Caboto, came to what is now the continental North America in the year AD 1497, even prior to Amerigo Vespucci. Now, albeit far to the north near Cape Breton Island in the northern part of Nova Scotia, or perhaps even further up in Newfoundland in Labrador. But the nearest of those three, Cape Breton, lies 480 miles east of Lubbock, Maine. That's the easternmost town in the continental United States, placing Cabot about the same distance away as Columbus, but still not in the US. Now, unlike Columbus, Cabot is not generally believed to have had any contact, detrimental or otherwise, with Native people. And like Columbus, he did not sail under an Italian flag. Modern Italy was not formed till St. Patrick's Day of 1861. Rather, Cabot sailed under a British one. And perhaps that flag and the nation it represented led to this whole conundrum. Or was it about denying Spain its history? Now, rather than fixate solely on the extremely unpleasant past, I expect today you will hear some proposals for positive change in South Carolina. Columbus celebrations and statues are important topics to discuss. One of our panelists for today is Chief Michelle Mitchum of the Pine Hill Indian Tribe, and she serves on a committee appointed by Mayor Steve Benjamin of Columbia to decide what to do with Columbia's Columbus statue, and I expect we'll hear more on that. Now, before my colleagues present on the subject at hand, I'd like to set the stage a little further. Following the discovery of Columbus by the people of the Bahamas in 1492, 3 additional expeditions would cross the Atlantic Ocean and return under Columbus. If Spain was indeed endeavoring to find Asia, it seems it was a colossal failure. By the second expedition, the enslavement of the Caribbean people took precedent only the discovery of gold, which was not in large quantities in the Greater Antilles. Columbus proposed a similar plan to the one Portugal was using for African enslavement. Humans in bondage below deck returned to Spain soon after from the islands of the Caribbean. In less than 3 decades, depopulation of the Caribbean by outright genocide, enslavement, and war would take several million human lives and affect countless survivors. By 1520, Spanish slaving expeditions would turn north to what is now the continental United States, having literally run out of humans to enslave. Ultimately, Columbus himself, in a fitting irony, would return to Spain in chains below the deck of a sailing ship. Now, I've asked Native American friends why they blame Columbus for the situation here in South Carolina, as he never stepped foot in what is now the US. And until I went back and read more closely the history of New Spain, I did not fully comprehend. However, I now see the connection quite clearly. When Francisco de Gordillo and Lucas Vazquez de Ayllon came to Winyah Bay in Georgetown, South Carolina in 1521, they were forced to find people to enslave outside the Caribbean. And they came to the land Native people called Chicora. And obviously that's over here on our North American map. And they took 60 Chicora Indians back to the Caribbean. And only one, Francisco de Chicora, would return to what is now South Carolina. Another one of our panelists for today is Chief Hatcher of the Waccamaw Indians. And they're from the vicinity of Winyah Bay, so ground zero for European invasion and impact in what is now South Carolina. At the time of Ayllon, he returned in 1526 to settle the coast somewhere on the South Carolina-Georgia coast. The enslaved people he brought with him at that point were not natives. They were abducted from Africa. Professor Adam Biggs has been asked to draw parallels between Caribbean enslavement and African enslavement in the Atlantic world. Now, Bartolomé de las Casas was the first Catholic priest conferred in the New World, and he documented the atrocities committed in the name of the Spanish crown. The people Columbus encountered were the Taíno, culturally and linguistically Arawakan Indians residing in the Greater Antilles, including Hispaniola. Within 50 years, this group was largely decimated via genocide, slavery, and brutality, first brought to light by this Spanish missionary and historian. He went to Hispaniola in 1505, was given a land grant which included slaves. But he gave a sermon in 1514 denouncing slavery, returned his slaves to the governor, and after was a long proponent for the better treatment of Indian slaves. Interesting, while he sought an end to the enslavement of the Caribbean native people, he suggested African slavery could replace it. He later retracted, but the damage was done. Many Taíno and other natives of the so-called New World were brought to Spain and forced into slavery. One last connection from the native people of South Carolina to the native people of the Caribbean follows. At the close of the Yamasee War in 1717, the prisoners of that war were shipped to the Caribbean by their British colonial captors to work in the sugar plantations. Obviously, the population depletion and the impact to native populations is connected in both of these locales. Later, British colonial officials and private parties would enslave both South Carolina Native Americans and African people to work in the rice, indigo, and cotton industries, and built a vibrant white economy on the backs of these people. In 1740, the Slave Code of South Carolina both normalized and legalized slavery of both African and Native people, outlawing most, if not all, of their cultural traditions, including music. The closer one looks at Columbus, the more confusing it all becomes, and the realization that the Columbus controversy is multifaceted emerges. These facets include erroneous depiction of continental discovery, The false and enduring historical narrative institutionalized and taught to U.S. youth. On that point, I'll stop and say that's changing. I looked at my son's U.S. history junior high school textbook today. The first sentence in that book says, Columbus did not discover North America. And then Columbus's name has been used on many things, including my hometown of Columbia, South Carolina. And the sport team mascots around the country are another legacy of Columbus. As the South Carolina Native American leaders have been urging USC Lancaster's Native American Studies faculty since 2006, tell our true story. Well, today, we will hear that story told by South Carolina Native Americans. It's quite obvious that the time has come in the United States to rethink and critically evaluate history, heroes, monuments, and the ethnocentric attitudes that have led to bias and unrest along racial lines, and try to develop strategies for peace, equity, and inclusion for all citizens. Let's face it, historical figures, past events, commemorative monuments mean different things to different people. One only needs to look at the Confederate monument situation for such evidence. As we're doing this, we should strive to be cautious and considerate as we navigate these difficult issues, widen our focus to include the views of all people, and remain open-minded and hear every tone. More to the point, it's not just the monuments or commemorations that need to be changed as much as it is the dire need to better understand our cultural diversity and the plurality of our states and communities that collectively form the human fabric of our country. Now, while invoking a term such as fabric might seem cliche, I've often heard the US referred to as a melting pot or as an ethnic stew, yet we are more like a quilt, fragments of fabric stitched together side by side, standing alone and separate with clear boundaries. Now, we cannot change history, but we can certainly shape a better future moving forward. I've asked each of the panelists to prepare and present a 10-minute statement. Following the presentations, Dr. Brooke Bauer will synthesize the proceedings with some closing remarks. Dr. Bauer wrote a very powerful op-ed, first appeared here in the Lancaster News and has appeared in newspapers across the state in the last week or so, very powerful, and that's on our website. Following her review, we'll open it up for questions and answers from the Zoom audience. And what you should do is use the chat feature, type your question into the chat feature, and we will answer them at the end of all of the comments and panelists today. So with that introduction, let me introduce to you Chief Michelle Mitchum of the Pine Hill Indian Tribe Community Development Initiative. She is the CEO of. Chief Mitchum, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion. Chris, thank you for that wonderful presentation to give us a bit of a history lesson there on Christopher Columbus and his routes and purposes. Christopher Columbus, my understanding in research is that he lived during an age of what they call the Age of Discovery. He actually begged the King and Queen of Spain for 6 years to allow him to go on this voyage, to bankroll it for him, because he was of the opinion that he could deliver Jerusalem and find a new route to an area that was already being used by the Portugal traders, but he got lost and he ended up in the Caribbean islands. The agreement that he had with the King and Queen was signed April the 17th, 1492, and in the agreement, he was allowed to keep 10% of the pearls, precious stones, gold, silver, spices, which may be bought, bartered, discovered, or obtained. And he would also be the governor of any land that he found. It's interesting that I found that Rodrigo de Triana, I believe is how you pronounce that, was actually the first person to see land on October the 12th, 1492, on one of the Columbus's ships. But he was never given the reward of gold that was promised him Columbus actually kept that for himself so that he would have claim to first sight of land. The Santa Maria actually sank, leaving 39 men behind to settle in what he called Santo Domingo. His governorship was so horrible that Spain sent an investigator. Columbus was arrested and returned to Spain in chains. But before that happened, he had instituted a tribute system, ordering Indians to furnish gold every 3 months. And if they did not furnish enough gold, their hands were cut off. He brought back 550 enslaved people to Queen Isabella to compensate for not bringing back what he had promised. And she was so appalled that he had enslaved what she considered to be Spanish subjects. And eventually the king and queen banned enslaving people in these areas and ordered them to be freed. However, the practice of slavery had now been established. Christopher Columbus argued that the world was shaped like a pear, which made him a laughingstock in Europe. We're not even sure where he's buried. He's allegedly buried in 2 places in the world, Seville, Spain, and Santo Domingo. What has this led to? It's led to slavery. He is deemed the father of slavery. He started sex trafficking. He turned 10-year-old girls into wives. He's the father of a lot of atrocities that continued on. After 2 years after the king and queen banned slavery among the Indians, they started slavery among the Africans. When you fast forward that to the United States, the one thing you don't hear in this history is he ever set foot on the United States soil or South Carolina or even in Columbia, South Carolina. And my people, being from Columbia, take a lot of issue with the fact that there was a statue in Columbia honoring someone who's never been here, and is the forebear of so much horrific experience for people who even he said was from his own notes. I pulled this in specific because I thought this was very interesting. He wrote, "They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know of them, for I showed them a sword. They took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." He's also quoted that the Indians were, and I'm quoting again, "fit to be ordered about and made to work, to sow, and do everything else that may be needed." And he went on to write that all that they are ordered to do, they do without opposition. Well, of course, when your threat of being your hands cut off or your tongue cut out or your children taken away from you or being put into slavery, you can get a person to do almost anything that you want them to do to spare them that kind of pain and anguish and this emotional distress. Christopher Columbus, as far as the United States, his so-called legacy became the makeshift history of the United States after the War of Independence. And the creation came from the forefathers wanting to detach from having any historical reference to England, thereby creating their own history completely, well, I can't say completely, almost entirely based on Washington Irving's writings of Christopher Columbus. Columbia was the personification of Columbus that the United States took on. Columbia was a lady, a caricature that was replaced by the Statue of Liberty. He has no history here, yet his history influenced so much in the United States and in South Carolina. South Carolina is one of the original 13 colonies. South Carolina was very involved in trading slaves. There was a great deal of, even in the early 1670s and 80s, 90s, even that early, the practice of Columbus's institution of the tribute system was exercised. Native Americans in South Carolina were to deliver a certain amount of deer skins and other items in order to keep peace. So this practice that he created continued on. So while he never set foot here, his ideas managed to make it here. And what has that turned into in our time? Things that we see today. I was reading earlier, just before this this panel discussion started, an article came up on my phone about Donald Neely, 44-year-old black homeless man in Galveston, Texas, last year was arrested for criminal trespass. And during his arrest, he was led by officers on horseback. He was attached to a rope, attached to handcuffs held by the officers, and displayed much the same way as a slave would have been displayed during slave trade in the United States and in South Carolina. We have Black Lives Matter. We have Native Lives Matter. The idea that we celebrate Christopher Columbus in a way where he is deemed historically relevant to the United States because he discovered something, is argued that he didn't discover anything. You can't discover what was already there. People were already there. He found maybe, but he certainly didn't discover anything, and definitely not in South Carolina or the United States. I've talked to several people over the past month or so because of my involvement with the Columbia Commission about the statue, their feelings for the statue and Christopher Columbus's so-called legacy. And even in the commission, the committee roundtable for the city of Columbia, I've made the statement that I do not speak for all Native Americans in this state or the country, but the mood for Native Americans is that Christopher Columbus is the equivalent of Hitler. And if this was a statue of Hitler, would we be having this discussion at all? And I think it's fair to ask the same question of, would we be celebrating this day as Christopher Columbus Day if we put him in the same light as Hitler, one that he, by his own writing, seems to deserve? When you put context to it, it would be more appropriate for South Carolina to adopt the October 12th date as Indigenous Peoples Day. Even Spain celebrates today as Hispanic Day. We're celebrating mistakes. We're celebrating atrocities. We're celebrating all of the things that we're trying to counter through peace and unity. And for what? Why are we celebrating a person who created this much upheaval for the Caribbean islands in the pay of Spain and against Spain's wishes? I feel like if the state would change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, that it would put Christopher Columbus's legacy as it is in a better perspective, to celebrate the people, honor the people that lost life, limb, family members because of Christopher Columbus, and it might bring about a healing to people of color across the board. I found it interesting. I received an email the other day sharing the president's most recent Christopher Columbus proclamation, alleging that radical activists seek to tarnish the explorer's legacy. I suppose we are all very radical activists by speaking the truth. And I noted that, in my mind, I noted that if we were in the Caribbean islands during the days of Columbus, our tongues would have been cut out so that we could not speak the truth. Genocide is a very serious topic. It's a very emotional topic. It's very inflaming in some ways. But again, what he did is equivalent to what Hitler did. And for the president to put in a proclamation that, and I'm quoting here, these extremists seek to replace discussion of his vast contributions with talk of failings, his discoveries with atrocities, and his achievements with transgressions. I don't think that we are trying to replace anything with talk of failings or atrocities or transgressions. I think that Christopher Columbus and his crew that recorded all of their activity explained very well what their failings were, what their atrocities were, and what their transgressions were. That we, even at the highest level in the United States, we have a disagreement on what the basis of the fabric of America is very troubling to me. That the President of the United States thinks that a discussion about Christopher Columbus's true history, as provided by Christopher Columbus, is an attack on him, and that he has any place in American history is very upsetting to me. I would hope that the Commander-in-Chief for the United States would have a better understanding of the history of the country that he represents. As far as South Carolina, I can only call on our legislators to change the tide and move toward changing Christopher Columbus Day in South Carolina to Indigenous Peoples Day. Will it right or wrong? No. Will it change the topic? Probably not. Will it heal anything? Obviously, no. But it is a step in the right direction to all of these things. Christopher Columbus's legacy starbursted so many things into action that have just been horrific. However, those things created led to, I can't say created, led to colonizing. He, as the father of slavery, he opened the doors to slave trade, which created the slave trade triangle that South Carolina was involved in. So while we cannot credit Christopher Columbus with ever setting foot here, his ideas made it here. Being the mother of a second generation Italian American, Christopher Columbus was not ever a big deal for my stepson. He didn't understand why we celebrated Christopher Columbus Day and often asked me, what did the man ever do that he deserved everybody getting a 10% off day at the store? I don't know. I don't know how to answer questions like that as a mother. As a Native American, we do not celebrate Christopher Columbus Day. We celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. Our powwow, Honor the Ancestors powwow, which was held just this past weekend, is intentionally the weekend before Columbus Day on purpose, and has been for a long time, because it is the introduction to Indigenous Peoples Day as we celebrate it. I hope that the information that I've presented here is helpful to everyone in understanding our position, especially Pine Hill Indian Tribe, and the initiative that we operate as far as the idea of Columbia and the statue of Columbus in Columbia being inappropriate, shed some light, and I'm sure Chief Hatcher will, and all of the other panelists will further enlighten everybody. But I hope I've been able to kind of lay the ground for the discussion of why we should change Columbus Day in South Carolina, at least, to Indigenous Peoples Day, and change the foreground of how we recognize Christopher Columbus in world history. I've often said world history is his place, not American history, not South Carolina history, and not the history of Columbia. And I've also said repeatedly that I do not personally believe that it is right to offend one group of people, which would be the Italian Americans, in order to appease another group of people, which would be everyone who is against Christopher Columbus being celebrated. There has to be a common ground here, and I think that common ground is found in the truth. Thank you, Chris, for inviting me to this discussion. And I'm going to turn this back over to you. If there's any, I'm going to mute my mic. If anybody has any questions for me, just let me know.
Thank you, Chief Mitchum. We'll take questions at the end. Our next panelist is Chief Buster Hatcher of the Waccamaw Indian people. As I said previously, they're down there in Horry County and the lower part of the state, or the upper part of the coast there in Winyah Bay. Chief Hatcher, the floor is yours. Turn your mic on. There you go.
Okay, well, I didn't know how to turn it on, but you know, Chief Mitchum said quite a few things that were very valid and very important to hear, because I've always wondered why things in history often just don't make sense. I want to say up front, though, that I speak for me and not for all Indian people. What I say is my opinion and may not be that of any other person, native or not. But prior to the Revolutionary War, this continent was widely populated. Houses, cities, fields, trails, and even garbage dumps were in abundance here. Maybe they didn't look like the houses today, but their purpose was the same. Moms, dads, uncles, aunts, granddads, grandmothers were here, and their roles then were pretty much the same as they are now. We loved our children. We loved mom and dad, and we took measures to ensure that they were fed and protected. We didn't have welfare, but our people took care of the sick and disabled and elderly. We did more than just feed them. Whatever they needed doing, we did for them. We lived wherever we liked, and when we left, we were not offended if someone else moved in. We had no concept of owning land by title and deed. And even if we did, there were no courthouses in which to register them. And there was no written language that we could use to record it. However, our rights to own lands on which our parents and grandparents raised us, and even the houses in which we lived, were not protected or honored by the conquering leadership. I use the word conquered, but a lot of us didn't know we were being conquered. We were just raising our crops, feeding and protecting our family while the Revolutionary War was progressing. After the war, the governors and other political powers of the new state of South Carolina started to sell, barter, or otherwise give our homeland away. There were land grants of native people to non-native people, and I never did understand why. Even before the Revolutionary War, the king did the same thing. Why did the king of a foreign country just give away lands that, as far as I'm concerned, he didn't own? The only answer I can offer is that they saw us as non-human. Why would someone just take a person's land that they had occupied or owned for centuries and give it to someone else? It only makes sense that they thought themselves superior, as they were human and we were not. It's as if we are also kin to property. They never cared what we thought, how much we suffered, what was good or bad for us, or even where we lived or died. They did give away land for which they had no legal claim. Their thoughts then and now seem to be the general idea of to the victor goes the spoils. In other words, I'm the biggest kid on this block, and if I take your candy, it's mine and you can just get over it. Maybe the governor gave large parcels of land to his daughter or his son or his friend, or maybe a political ally. Maybe he sold it for his own personal gain. I just wonder how it made sense to both sides. The giver giving things that he or she didn't own, and the taker not caring from whence it came as long as they got it. There were then, as well as now, people who did not follow that logic. There was pressure from some asking the state to act more responsibly and with compassion, not to use violence to enforce occupancy. There were others that wanted their piece of the action, and had no concern about how they got it. So history started to change. Legislators did not slow or stop the taking of the land and the people didn't slow or stop the occupying of the land that they received. However, the legislators did start to make it more appealing to those that opposed it. They wanted to keep the land and make it look as if they had some right to it. As a consequence, Indians started on our long walk into becoming invisible. Our lifestyles were distorted. We became barbarians. Those who defended their homes and families were simply declared to be savages and lawless. They even quoted the Bible to justify such treatment of our people. The state authorized deadly force to hasten the incursion of our lands and on us. As time passed, history changed to justify whatever was done. Although it was not righteous, but greed that was the fodder that brought it. Laws banning the term Indian on government documents. Laws that were designed to deny that people today are descendants of a native people from those times. Federal laws demanded that we show a genealogical tie, direct line tie, of our people today to a non-Waccamaw at the first time of Waccamaw was ever recorded in history. That's a time when there was no recording of births, deaths, events, or even of a name. We call it documentary genocide. What was done, and that cannot be changed. However, the reasons for why and how things were done is disputable. In my view, the powers that be changed the history to make their ancestors look historic rather than greedy. It's not hard to do if you have the books, the ink, the printer, and you control the schools. It was a continuation of the 1400s. The same things happened. With whatever intentions Columbus sailed, he did things that I consider to be inhumane, barbaric, autocracies. Some people consider him a hero. To make it so, they rewrote and revised the history and taught it as a truth to our youth. People hailed Columbus as a brave explorer, and perhaps he was brave. Perhaps the incentive was worth the risk. If so, he was more greedy than brave. He asked for and received a tremendous amount of wealth and fame for his voyages. However, that is not to me the gist of my opposition. If a president, a governor, or whoever today authorized grown men to forcibly rape 12-year-old or even younger girls, to kill their father if he tried to protect her, and to kill her if she became pregnant, will we turn away and say, well, that was then and this is now, and he was brave? Why does the time frame make a difference? Just because it is past, a villain is still a villain. A murderer is a murderer. A rapist is a rapist. And a pedophile is a pedophile. Such people are not purified by time and circumstance. Is it not an insult to declare such a man a hero? If the United States Supreme Court declared it legal to maim, kill, or publicly lop off the hands of women, mothers, fathers, and even children for not making the Supreme Court richer, would this be okay as long as it's not your people? Some time ago, for reasons I will never understand, the legislators of the United States of America not only sanctioned the actions mentioned, but overtly declared Columbus an American hero and even named a holiday in his honor. Forgive my contempt, but is Ted Bundy Day or Jim Jones Day, or maybe even a Hitler Day possible in our future? I believe that there are legitimate heroes deserving praise in our history. We don't need to rewrite history to have heroes. We don't have to go outside of this country to find one either. I find it mind-boggling that with all the great Americans in our short history, we still have Columbus's name on a holiday. Monuments to people should not be banned, but I should not be compelled to support a lie designed to make a tyrant look like a hero either. I have no concern about any flag, any monument, any symbol, or any other thing that can be erected to honor anyone, including Satan, Hitler, Robert E. Lee, Benedict Arnold, or anyone else, as long as it's on their private property. However, when they put it on public land supported by taxpayers' hard-earned money, it becomes offensive to me. I say let those who want to honor people of questionable morals do so on their own land, not on our land. In Myrtle Beach, just 2 weeks ago, I attended a Myrtle Beach City Council meeting, and the mayor gave me a plaque where the city of Myrtle Beach has now done away with Columbus Day and is now calling it Indigenous Peoples Day. I don't know whether it should be Indigenous Peoples Day. It's okay with me if they just call it Americans Day, and all of us can celebrate it. But call it Columbus Day is an insult. Thank you, Chris, for doing this, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I have a strong opinion. I've been fighting this bear, batting my head on this brick for almost 30 years now. I am starting to see some change in the state. There's still a lot of things we need to do, but we need to start becoming visible. As American Indian people, we need to start becoming visible. People need to quit making laws without looking at how it's going to affect the Native American citizens of this state. And I think that the University of South Carolina and Chief Mitchum and other leaders in the state are slowly pulling us towards that reality. For that, I thank you all. And Chris and whoever records the questions and answers, if I can answer any question, I'll be happy to do so. Chris, you just tell me when. Thank you all.
Thank you, Chief Hatcher. Appreciate that. Our next panelist is Professor Adam Biggs, who teaches history here at University of South Carolina at Lancaster. He's also co-chair of our, I'm going to mess this up, Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity Committee.
That's right.
Here at the university, and we've asked Adam to draw parallels between African slavery and Caribbean slavery and other thoughts he might have. Floor is yours, Adam.
Thanks, Chris. So I should just start out by saying that I did not get the memo that you were asking me to draw the comparisons between African and Atlantic and Caribbean slavery. And so I have a much different kind of approach here today that I'm gonna share with you guys. But there's a lot of stuff that, I mean, I think that I've been hearing from Chief Mitchum and Chief Hatcher that I just think is really fascinating and maybe a great place to start with, at least in terms of when I think about these types of moments, like these types of days or statues that are dedicated to recognizing particular individuals. You know, I think maybe one of the premises that I like to think about, what purpose do these statues or holidays serve for us today? Right? I think that's worthwhile to think about. Like, what purpose, what work do we like these events or these entities to do in the present moment? And I also want to introduce the idea that many times when we think about statues, when we think about holidays, there's a level of permanence that we think about with them. And I want us to kind of, perhaps in the discussion, but as we go on, to kind of maybe loosen that idea a little bit. The idea that a statue is something that is permanent and that can never be changed, or that a holiday is something that is permanent and that can never be changed. Because one thing we know is that statues, holidays, they all have histories in and of themselves, right? We're going to talk a bit, and we've been talking a bit about Columbus as a historical figure, but we can also talk about Columbus Day as a historical entity, right? We can also talk about particular statues as historical entities, and I want to talk a little bit about that today. One of the things I think we can certainly say is that whatever work these different entities do in the present, it is rarely about preserving truth, and it is rarely about preserving history, because more often than not, these entities seem to do more to distort our understanding of the past and really to co-opt and usurp our understanding of the past and to create myths that really take us away from what really happened. And so in some ways, you know, whenever when I'm in class and I'm working on teaching, I find myself, I teach a lot against these days, or a lot against these memorials, a lot against these statues, because in many ways, even in their creation, a lot of what they are intended to do is to distort and to shape narratives in ways that may not actually reflect the past. All right, and so one of the things that maybe we can also conceptualize is that as we are thinking about reshaping them, and Chief Hatcher, you sort of started to talk about this as well, and Chief Mitchum, you did as well. Like, how could we rethink what kind of monuments, what kind of day this could be. I mean, it has been rethought of and reconceptualized in countries outside the United States, really in the Central America and South America. There are a number of different ways that people have reconceptualized thinking about Columbus Day that is designed to center the stories of indigenous people. But where I want to start with is, I want to think about Columbus Day and the problem of the hagiographic narrative. All right, now when I say that, the hagiographic narrative, you guys, you may or may not be familiar with that term, but that's essentially the story of the great man, right? And we know essentially who the great man is. It emphasizes the individual, right? It has a very heroic quality to it. It stresses how courageous he was. It stresses the risk that he took, and it amplifies an exceptional achievement that is said to be a great benefit to man and worthy of immortal recognition, right? And this is sort of the narrative. This is the hagiographic narrative. This individual who has done these great achievements for mankind and humanity, right? Now, the problem with that is from a historical sense, right? As a historian, there's something just that fundamentally distorts the process of history here, right? Because the hagiographic narrative, with the emphasis that it puts on the individual and the emphasis that it puts on, well, there are other parts that I'll get into further, but the emphasis it puts on the individual, what it does is it distorts the importance of collaboration, cooperation, and dialogue and exchange in historical processes and in historical innovations. So when we think about something like Columbus's encounter with the Americas, right? We can give him credit for the hagiographic narrative, gives him credit for this unique achievement, right? But when we look at this in the historical process, we also have to take into account, you know, who else did he collaborate with and who else aided in this process, right? When we talk about really basic things like the types of technology that was used in the ships and in the sails to move across the ocean, right? That's not stuff that Columbus invented or came up with himself. That is something that was developed and fostered and developed over time through the efforts that were collaborative and through the networks of mariners that took part in these, right? When we talk about even things like nautical maps and wind patterns, these are not things that somehow the other Columbus had knowledge of, that he just manifested, right? These were things that were developed and built over time and that he benefited from. And in many ways, you know, and we have already talked a bit about, you know, how in some ways he was sort of out of the loop or sort of, you know, misunderstood a lot of the knowledge that was fairly standardized at the time. The idea, he thought that the globe was actually smaller than it was. The trip to circumnavigate the world was actually smaller than it was, and which is part of the reason why he sort of took the direction that he did, which led him to get lost. When we think about something like that, right? I mean, we would not think of, for example, the moon landing as just being the product of Neil Armstrong, right? There are engineers, there are scientists, there are journalists and politicians and citizens who are providing tax funding and other types of source of support for an effort and an endeavor like that. We would not say and suggest that Neil Armstrong discovered the moon, right? Now, sometimes we think about somebody like King. We think of Martin Luther King as like the leader of civil rights activism, but this is also in many ways a distortion of the past, right? Because when we focus so much on the hagiographic narrative, right, we amplify the individual, what we often miss is the role that so many Black women played, right, in behind the scenes organizing on the ground in the churches that were fundamental to actually making the civil rights movement effective. And so when we talk about the hagiographic narrative, the problem with this is that the extent that it actually distorts the past, right? But some other problems come up when we talk about the hagiographic narrative. And part of that is the notion of exceptionalism, right? Because with the hagiographic narrative, there is no real chance, right? The narrative suggests that this individual is special, right? In some way, they have been ordained by God or ordained by a higher power. and that they're predestined to their outcome, right? And when we understand that, the problem with that is that it creates a space where they no longer have to adhere to the same moral and ethical standards as the rest of us, because we know, right, because they're preordained that they're going to do something great. And so when we think about when we rely on the hagiographic narrative, the ends serves as a justification for the means. And so conversations about the murder, the rape, and the violence, cruelty, and genocide and exploitation of indigenous people, that's just seen as collateral damage, right? The enslavement of Africans, that's just seen as collateral damage to this larger enterprise that is viewed as being preordained and predestined, right? And so we no longer think about those costs as being significant, right? They become, and I am not familiar with it. I did not read Trump's recent declaration from Friday, but much of what he is saying, it fits, I mean, perfectly with this. It is the denial of these costs, right? The denial of these collateral damage that goes with this notion of a preordained destiny, right? A preordained greatness, if we will, right? And we know, I mean, it's not a myth, it's not unknown, it's not a radical narrative to say that in 1499, Columbus loses his governorship because of the violence and the tyranny that he is directing toward indigenous peoples. So this is not like, you don't have to be radical, you just have to be honest. You just have to be thorough. You just have to have sort of a basic understanding of the historical moment to know that this is true. But when we talk about sort of how we got here, right? I think when we talk a little bit about how we got to this sort of understanding of Columbus Day, I think there is sort of another interesting story to tell, right? There's another interesting story that that I just want to talk about, and then I will wrap up. Which is to say, there were numerous efforts to recognize Columbus, or to acknowledge Columbus when we think about the different cities, or when we think about different events that took place. The 13 colonies for a time were referred to as Columbia as well. But the first Columbus Day came in 1892, right? And the first official day that was endorsed by President Ben Harrison was done and was enacted in response to a lynching that had taken place in New Orleans. 11 Italian immigrants had been killed by lynching in New Orleans after being blamed for killing a popular police chief at the time. Right now, there was no indictment. They were not tried for these crimes. This was a mass lynching of 11 Italian immigrants. And part of the reason for this is that in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, when we talk about Italian immigrants, we can also talk about Irish immigrants. Chris was talking a little bit about that, his own background. First, Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants were Catholic, which was seen as an other in American society, right? But in many respects, they were also put in a similar sort of standing. They were also racialized, I should say. They weren't seen as white in the same way that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants were, okay? And so many of the stereotypes, many of that, the way that people conceptualized African Americans at that time also got applied to Italians, right? They were seen as criminals. They were seen as brutes. They were seen as unfit for society, right? And so part of the effort, the lynching that took place, part of it was directed at that, was utilized by those stereotypes that were used to characterize Italians, right? The Italian government, though, played a role in advocating for their citizens who had lost their lives, and partly in an effort to appease the Italian government, and also in an effort to appease and address this sense of exclusion that Italian Americans were facing. That was part of the reason why President Harrison began that first Columbus Day. And I don't think it was a singular event at the time in 1892. And so the intention was very much to put Columbus in the center of the American narrative, okay? So part of what he is trying to do is he's trying to take this image of an Italian and put him at the center of the American story in an effort to create a sense of inclusion for Italian Americans. But the only way you can really do that, right? The only way you can really do that is if you sanitize his history. And so much of when we talk about the collateral damage, when we talk about the violence, when we talk about the exploitation, when we talk about the genocide that Columbus is very complicit in, all of that cannot have a role in this narrative. But the thing about this is that this fits very well, right, for Americans, white Americans in the late 19th and early 20th century, right? Because this is a time when in the 1890s, there are more lynchings in the United States than in any other time in our history, right? This is the height of lynching in the United States. And the singular premise behind lynching was the propagation of white supremacy. And so telling a sanitized story, right? Telling a sanitized story about the role of Italians in American history that also marginalizes the stories of people of color, right? That marginalizes the violence. That's a very effective way for Italian Americans to write themselves into the narrative of whiteness, okay? And one of the things that we know is that when it comes to integrating into American society, the key to inclusion is our willingness to embrace these narratives of white supremacy. And fundamental to the narratives of white supremacy are violence and genocide and exploitation of people of color. And so even with that well-intention, right, even with the good intention behind it, we still see that this hagiographic narrative has very real and problematic consequences, which I think we see playing out today, and that I hope we can continue to talk about in the rest of the event.
Thank you, Professor Biggs. Appreciate that. And thanks for bringing up the Chief Hennessy incident in New Orleans, which you are right. The first Columbus Day was 100 years before that in 1792 in New York City, but that was the first one that was proclamated by a US president. All right, our next panelist is Dr. Brooke Bauer. Dr. Bauer is Professor of Native American Studies, History, and Women's Studies here at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster. All yours, Brooke.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here today, zooming in to hear this conversation take place today. I think all of our speakers so far have given you a lot of information to think about. Before I start, I want to take just a second to, as this Zoom is coming out of the University of South Carolina, Lancaster, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we're gathering on the ancestral land of the Catawba Indians, and that I recognize that generations of Catawba people, their ancestors, served as stewards of the land, and which furthers USCL's commitment to learn also how to be stewards of the land that the campus is on. With that said, I would like to ask for you guys just to go with me on this. Imagine you're sitting at home and a stranger comes to the front door of your house. She or he seems really friendly at first, but they are armed to the teeth. 2 days later, the stranger tells you, I lay claim to your home, and the only way that you can survive, that your family can survive, is if you do precisely as I say. Or you can face the consequence, which is justified. The consequences of enslavement or death. This is justified war because you are our subjects. You belong to me. Later on in time, this person is viewed as a hero for taking your home. How would you feel? So I just leave you with that just to think about. But it brings me to the question that most of our panelists have mentioned. Focusing on Columbus Day, how is it still a thing? This question is not a new one. It's not recent to 2020. In 1977, the idea of replacing Columbus Day with a day commemorating the indigenous people of North America came out of the International Conference on Discrimination Against Indigenous Populations in the Americas, which was sponsored by the United Nations. Colorado's American Indian Movement, a grassroots movement, began protesting the celebration of Columbus Day in the 1980s. Berkeley, California was the first to rename Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day in 1992. More recently, in 2014, the Washington Post proposed the question that I just asked, how is this still a thing? In an article that focused on the history of Christopher Columbus and the celebration of Columbus Day. That same year, HBO's John Oliver did a segment on Columbus Day posing the same question. In 2019 and 20, the National Congress of American Indians, which is an organization that serves the broad interest of tribal governments and communities, pushed back against the celebration of Columbus Day. In 2020, earlier this year, NCAI's, the National Congress of American Indians, their president stated, this growing movement across the country to rid our shared spaces of symbols that represent hate, genocide, and bigotry illustrates that it is past time for all cities to stand on the right side of history moving forward. And I think you've heard this very clearly today from Chief Mitchum, Chief Hatcher, and Professor Biggs. Indeed, Columbus Day is giving people pause, or the celebration of Columbus Day is giving people pause. And they're starting to ask that question, how is this still a thing? Especially given, as was mentioned earlier, the recent proclamation on Columbus Day that accused historians and indigenous peoples as radical adherents who seek to revise Columbus Day, deprive it of any splendor, and mark it as inherently sinister. As you have heard from the panelists, this is not a revisionist style of history. It's simply using firsthand accounts to support our arguments. And going further, as you've heard from our guest speakers today, Columbus was not a hero, nor should he be idolized in the 21st century. In fact, for Native Americans across the nation, Columbus is remembered as the perpetrator of immense violence, greedily seeking gold and using Indian slavery to increase his wealth. I'm not implying or stating that Columbus is responsible for every negative thing that has happened in the United States. His arrival in the West Indies, however, was the spark that set all the effects of colonialism in motion. So if you were to ask a Native American person, what, in your opinion, does Columbus Day represent to you? You'll probably receive some words that I can't say on Zoom, but you'll also hear one-word answers like genocide, confusion, sadness, anger, evilness, terrorism, murderer, rape. Most Native people understand the effects that Christopher Columbus's exploration had on their ancestors. We understand the story of Columbus. We understand that the story of Columbus has been sanitized, as Professor Biggs mentioned, giving a more one-sided perspective of, quote, discovery, unquote, when in fact he discovered nothing. We know that Columbus's arrival into the Western Hemisphere was the beginning of immense death and devastation to indigenous people across the Western Hemisphere. And although some people view Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean as a day of a new beginning of exploration and discovery, we see his arrival as the beginning of an era of conquest and death. As mentioned previously by most of the speakers, Columbus never stepped foot in North America. Leif Erikson, as Professor Judge explained, beat him by 500 to 600 years. So why does the United States celebrate a violent man who got lost in the West Indies instead of the people who have loved and protected this land for longer than the existence of the United States? The truth is that Columbus left a legacy of enslaving, brutalizing, and killing indigenous people. And as these talks are made here today, some Americans think that renaming Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day is being too sensitive, being too politically correct. I say it's just one step toward historical correctness, one step away from whitewashing American history. American history, as I tell my students every semester, has not always been glorious. Instead, it is full of violence and exploitation of Native Americans and African Americans. And this type of history goes against the great American narrative of freedom, patriotism, and prosperity that is limited in reality to a few. Instead, as the panelists have discussed here today, American history is also often told from the perspective of European or Anglo-American colonizers. These people had the most power and continue to have the most power. When Native Americans and African Americans try to tell American history from the perspective of an indigenous person or a Black person, we often hear the white majority respond, "No, you've blown it out of proportion. You're judging him by today's standards." Indians killed and enslaved too. Or you are practicing cultural cleansing. And I'll say that last one more time. You are practicing cultural cleansing. This last response is rich with irony because this is exactly what happened to our ancestors. Now, Columbus's immediate legacy included the brutality of enslavement, murder, dismemberment, sexual assault against the Taino people, as you've heard today. His arrival to Hispaniola triggered the spread of the international slave trade in the Western Hemisphere. Long-term effects are the same. These themes continue today in 2020. So that means that we must connect the present to the history of the past. Today, Native Americans experience racial profiling and police brutality at a higher rate than any other racial or ethnic group in America. Our mortality rate is 12% higher than African Americans, and 3 times the rate of whites. These are statistics that are rarely reported. Domestic and sexual violence against Native women and girls, it's a crisis in our nation. Native American girls and women are 10 times more likely to be killed compared to the average national murder rate. That includes both male and female. 4 out of 5 Native women are survivors of domestic or sexual violence that has happened at some point during their lives, largely at the hands of non-Native men. In addition, the federal and state governments continue to take Native children from their Native families and communities, arguing that they know what is best for our children. These disparities are especially urgent now as Native communities grapple with COVID-19 and because they have inadequate health care. Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma now is experiencing a high death rate. We heard earlier in the year how the Navajo Nation experienced the same thing. And this is because we don't have adequate sources or health care. Central to Native American struggle for justice is our fight to be visible to the public so that we can start addressing many of these crises. Most of South Carolina's Native people are largely ignored in discussions of violence, incarceration, voting rights, and health care data. We are treated as invisible because we are less than 1% minority. Because of this, we are often overlooked. Major agencies do not produce data about our populations, which decreases public awareness of the systemic effects of healthcare, criminal justice, food insecurity, economic development, and educational attainment. And the marginalization of South Carolina's Native Americans makes it so much harder for us to get state leaders, federal leaders to hear us because we don't have the numbers to make our voices heard. So I call on South Carolina to fix this invisibility. More cities, counties, and states are electing to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. Maine was the last state to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day in 2019. North Carolina, Alaska, South Dakota, Oregon, and Minnesota renamed the holiday in 2018. Lawmakers in these states renamed the holiday because, as they said, Christopher Columbus is often credited with discovering America, while he never actually set foot on the shores of the continental US. As for discovering, there were at least millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, Indigenous people living in the Western Hemisphere. At least 5 million natives live north of Mexico. So Native North America was not just this place waiting to be discovered. It had a history, and the people who lived there had a history that I believe should be acknowledged. South Carolina has not made the list of states that have adopted Indigenous Peoples Day. Which South Carolina cities and counties have renamed Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day? Well, you heard Chief Hatcher say Myrtle Beach recently did it. I think Lancaster County renamed the day. I'm not sure, but I can't answer this question fully because we don't have a comprehensive list of counties and cities in South Carolina that have chosen Indigenous Peoples Day over Columbus Day. Our state was once occupied by over 25 tribal polities that had working governments, had a citizenship, had an economy. These were Native people who loved and cared for this land long before European arrival. These are the descendants of these people continue to love this land. So I call on South Carolina saying, let's not be left behind. Let's show and celebrate our state's diversity. We, as South Carolina residents, should call on the state of South Carolina to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day to recognize the contributions that Native American people have made to our state. As one of the panelists said, I can't remember if it was Chief Hatcher or if it was Professor Biggs, our state wouldn't be the state it is today without Native Americans, without African Americans. So South Carolina natives, I called on in my op-ed for South Carolina to remove the Columbus statue permanently from the State House grounds. And instead, I call on our representatives to replace that statue with the Lady of Cofitachique, Sally or General New River of the Catawba, King Crow of the Lower Cherokee settlements, or a historic male or female leader of the PD, the Santee, Waccamaw, Cusco, Edisto, the Pine Hill community. I could continue the list of tribes. Finally, I encourage you all, especially those of you living in South Carolina, to write your state leaders calling on them to rename the day as Indigenous Peoples Day. So thank you, and I hope you have a lot of questions for our panelists.